Ladies and gentlemen.
Yesterday, more than 70 lawmakers in separate posts on social media suggested the president's cabinet must invoke the 25th Amendment and admit he's unfit for office. Congress should pass impeachment articles and vote to convict him, or both. During his first term, he was impeached twice and acquitted. We reached out to state lawmakers, or those who represent California, to pose our accountability question asking, do you support President Trump's actions in Iran or oppose them? Here's what they told us. California Senator Adam Schiff says, quote, Congress must finally reclaim its war power from this increasingly dangerous president before more service members get killed. Congressman David Valadao says, quote, I hope this moment pressures Iran to come to the table and helps to bring this conflict to a close.
Hey folks, Adam here. Nobody warned me about this either. Capitol Hill has shattered into an emergency as lawmakers from both parties demand Trump's immediate removal through impeachment or the 25th Amendment after he threatened to annihilate an entire civilization. The urgency reflects a rare bipartisan consensus that keeping him in power even one more day is too dangerous. And here is the detail that makes this moment fundamentally different from every previous round of removal talk we have witnessed over the past several years. The lawmakers making these demands are not speaking in vague abstractions or political generalities. They are citing specific constitutional frameworks. They are naming specific legal violations with precision and clarity. They are invoking the Geneva Conventions by name, international treaties that the United States has formally ratified and is legally bound to uphold. And they are putting Vice President J.D. Vance and every member of the Trump cabinet directly on notice that the entire country is watching what they do next, that their silence will be interpreted as complicity, and that history will judge their inaction harshly.
Raleigh Congresswoman Deborah Ross is joining other Democrats to create a new panel that would invoke the 25th Amendment and remove President Trump from office. The Congresswoman says his latest actions and comments about the war in Iran raise serious questions about his fitness to serve. She said it's more urgent than ever that Congress finally establish this independent commission and ensure the executive branch is subject to proper and thorough oversight.
This is not background noise. This is not the usual Tuesday in Washington where someone says something outrageous and everyone moves on by Thursday. This is a constitutional emergency playing out in real time, with senior senators invoking specific treaty frameworks and demanding specific procedural actions on a compressed emergency timeline. The wheels of government are supposed to move slowly, deliberately, with careful consideration and multiple layers of review. But right now, those wheels are being forced to spin faster than they ever have before because the threat is immediate, the danger is undeniable, and the president's own words have created a situation that cannot be ignored or explained away. It all started with a single post. One post on Truth Social from Donald Trump that used words so extreme, so legally consequential, and so potentially catastrophic that members of Congress who have spent entire careers managing the gap between political frustration and legal action suddenly decided that the gap had finally closed.
And Bay Area Congress members Ro Khanna and Nancy Pelosi, among more than 50 House Democrats, calling for Congress to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove President Trump from office. That was in response to his social media post earlier today, where he wrote of Iran, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight.
He's threatening the entire destruction of a civilization. He is calling Iranians animals. He is showing a total disregard for the humanity of people in Iran, in Gaza, in Cuba. This is a moral crime. It is a war crime. We need to be demanding that Congress convene today, and we need to be invoking the 25th Amendment.
We heard statements from a person whose mental stability has to be questioned for the statements that he has made about obliterating a civilization. A civilization. While the Republicans want to be seen and not willing to exercise the 25th Amendment, we have to do that in the public.
They could no longer look away. They could no longer rationalize. They could no longer tell themselves that this was just Trump being Trump. Just another example of his bombastic rhetoric that would blow over without any real consequences. Because this time, the rhetoric crossed a line that has been clearly drawn in international law for decades. And everyone who understands what is at stake knows that crossing that line carries consequences that cannot be undone. We are tracking breaking news right now on the rapidly escalating situation with Iran and the looming deadline that Trump has imposed. This morning, President Trump ramped up threats to launch a massive attack if Iran cannot forge a deal to open the Strait of Hormuz by the deadline he personally set. The president, posting on social media minutes ago, said, and I am quoting directly, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will." End quote. Those are the actual words of the President of the United States. A whole civilization will die tonight.
Next, it's Truth or Fake. And Vedika Bahal is with me in the studio. So, Vedika, Donald Trump may have announced a ceasefire in Iran, but it's done little to quieten the growing wave of Democratic lawmakers calling for his removal via the 25th Amendment. Tell us more.
Yes, Jenny, it's true that scores of Democrats have been raising the alarm about Donald Trump's mental stability and have been calling for his removal, saying that he is unfit to serve. And this is after he used genocidal language at Iran on Tuesday, where he posted, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." There was also his expletive-laden Easter Sunday post, where he told Iran to open the strait or that they will be living in hell. And this tentative ceasefire agreement hasn't done much to quash these calls for removal, because over 80 House Democrats have made social media posts saying that Trump's cabinet should invoke the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, declaring him unfit to serve, or Congress should impeach and convict him, or both.
Those words are now part of the permanent public record of the American presidency. Iran's leaders responded to Trump's other threats overnight with defiance, saying if more attacks are carried out, the United States will be blocked from getting oil and gas for years. Iran's president says more than 14 million Iranians have declared their readiness to give their lives to defend their country. The rhetoric is escalating on both sides, and the American president is leading the charge with language that sounds less like diplomacy and more like a threat of genocide. Now, before we go any further into the details of what is happening in Congress right now and why lawmakers are reacting with such urgency, I want to anchor this to the specific thing that set it off. Because the specific language of what Trump said matters enormously, and is the direct reason the constitutional and legal reaction has been as immediate, as specific, and as serious as it has been. You cannot understand why members of Congress are invoking the Geneva Conventions without understanding exactly what was said that made those invocations appropriate rather than theatrical. You cannot grasp the depth of the constitutional crisis without seeing the words that triggered it. Trump posted a warning to Iran on Truth Social, saying that a whole civilization could be wiped out if Iran did not reach a deal by the deadline he had personally imposed. A whole civilization. Those are not the words of a diplomat. They are not the words of someone managing a tense foreign policy situation with calculated strategic ambiguity. They are a public declaration by the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military that the annihilation of an entire human civilization is on the table as an American policy option. That is not hyperbole. That is not political rhetoric. That is a specific threat of mass civilian destruction made by the most powerful person on earth. And when Representative Ro Khanna stood up and called that statement a blatant violation of the Constitution and the Geneva Conventions, he was not being dramatic. He was not reaching for political rhetoric to generate headlines. He was making a specific legal argument grounded in international humanitarian law that the United States has formally ratified and is legally bound to enforce. The Geneva Conventions prohibit threats of mass violence against civilian populations. They were written specifically to prevent exactly this kind of statement from being made by national leaders. A president publicly threatening to wipe out a whole civilization is not a gray area under that framework. It is the kind of statement that the laws of war were specifically designed to prohibit leaders from making in their official capacity. And the fact that it came from the President of the United States, the leader of a nation that has signed those conventions and is legally bound by them, is precisely what elevated the congressional reaction from political outrage to constitutional emergency. This is not about partisan disagreement. This is about a sitting president violating treaties that the United States has formally committed to uphold. This is about a commander-in-chief potentially committing war crimes through public statements. This is about the leader of the free world threatening genocide on social media. Here is the context that makes this particular eruption so significant, beyond just the Iran threat that triggered it. Congress has been engaged in a slow and painful struggle over its relevance to questions of war and peace for years. Every time a president has used emergency powers to escalate military posture, impose economic sanctions, or position forces for conflict without formal congressional authorization, the legislative branch has pushed back and then ultimately deferred. The War Powers Resolution, The law passed after Vietnam, specifically to require congressional oversight of military action, has been tested and stretched and worked around by administration after administration without ever being fully enforced by a Congress that lacked the political will to follow through on its own legal authority. And what Trump's civilization threat represents to the members of Congress, who are now demanding an emergency session, is not just one more escalation in a long series of executive overreach. It is the moment where the rhetoric has become so extreme, so legally specific in its apparent violation, and so potentially catastrophic in its implications that the members who have been deferring and tolerating and watching from the sidelines are finally saying we have run out of road. This is a line, and if we do not act on it, we are complicit in whatever comes next. That is the emotional and constitutional reality driving the emergency session demand, and it is not going away quietly. So, here's what this video is going to walk through. And I want to be clear about each piece of it before we get into the detail, because each element of this story connects to the others in ways that the coverage of any single piece tends to miss. We are going to look at exactly what Senator Ed Markey, Senator Chris Murphy, and Representative Ro Khanna have said publicly, and what specifically they are calling for, because the specific demands matter and reveal how seriously these lawmakers are taking the constitutional dimensions of this situation. We are going to explain what an emergency congressional session actually means, procedurally, and what it would take to actually convene one in real time through either an impeachment proceeding or a 25th Amendment process on the compressed timeline these lawmakers are demanding. We are going to talk directly about the pressure this situation is creating for Vice President J.D. Vance and the cabinet members who are being publicly called out to either act through the 25th Amendment or stand publicly with a president, being accused of war crimes advocacy. And we are going to be honest about the path forward, what is realistically possible, what the constitutional math looks like, and why this moment matters, even if the immediate removal demands do not produce the immediate result these lawmakers are calling for. All right. Let us get into the specific details of what is actually being demanded on Capitol Hill right now. Because the specificity of these demands is part of what makes this moment different from previous rounds of removal rhetoric, and understanding exactly what each lawmaker is calling for is essential to understanding both the constitutional stakes and the strategic logic behind the combined impeachment and 25th Amendment push that is being deployed simultaneously across multiple Senate and House offices. Start with Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, who put out a statement calling on the House and Senate to reconvene on an emergency basis. Markey did not just say Trump should resign or that someone should look into the Iran comments. He made a precise procedural demand that the House should return to session and pass articles of impeachment, and that the Senate should vote on conviction and removal, or as an alternative pathway, that Vice President Vance and the cabinet should invoke Section 4 of the 25th Amendment and transfer executive authority to the vice president. Those are not the same demand. Those are two different constitutional mechanisms. And Markey is putting both of them on the table simultaneously, which signals that his concern is not about winning a specific procedural fight, but about using whatever mechanism moves fastest to remove a president he believes poses an immediate and ongoing danger. That is a different level of urgency than the usual calls for accountability that circulate through political media after a controversial presidential statement. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut echoed those demands explicitly and publicly. The fact that both Murphy and Markey, two of the most senior, most institutionally credible, and most substantively respected Democratic voices on foreign policy and national security questions in the Senate, are publicly and specifically aligned on the emergency removal demand sends a signal that the members of Congress who actually track these issues most closely are reading the specific situation Trump's civilization threat has created. Believe this is not a coalition of backbenchers making noise. This is the foreign policy wing of the Senate Democratic Caucus saying the situation is serious. These are not members who routinely engage in dramatic removal talk for political effect. They are members who have spent careers working on exactly the kinds of foreign policy and war powers questions that Trump's civilization threat implicates. When they say the situation requires emergency action, the people who track these issues most closely are taking that assessment seriously, in a way they might not if the same demand came from a more politically theatrical source. And then there is Representative Ro Khanna, whose statement was the most constitutionally specific of all the public demands. Khanna did not just call the Iran comments dangerous or irresponsible. He called them a blatant violation of the Constitution and the Geneva Conventions, and he said Congress must use every option available to remove Trump from office. The Geneva Convention's framing is the key detail. By invoking those specific international legal commitments the United States has formally made and is legally bound by, Khanna is arguing that this is not a political dispute about foreign policy preferences, it is a legal violation. And legal violations at this level, violations of the laws of war by a commander-in-chief, fall squarely within the category of high crimes and misdemeanors that the impeachment power was designed to address. That legal argument is why the word emergency is the right word for what is happening on Capitol Hill right now. Now, let us talk about the 25th Amendment dimension of this, because the specific pressure being applied to Vice President Vance and the cabinet through these public demands is more than rhetorical. It is a calculated strategic choice designed to put specific individuals on the record in a way that creates political consequences regardless of whether they act. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment gives the Vice President and a majority of the cabinet the constitutional authority to declare the president unable to discharge his duties and immediately transfer executive authority to the vice president, without any congressional vote required at that initial stage. The president can contest that declaration, and then Congress has to vote on it with a 2/3 threshold in both chambers to keep the vice president in charge. But the initial transfer can happen immediately, with the signatures of the VP and a cabinet majority. That is the emergency brake the Constitution built into the system for exactly this kind of situation. And by publicly and repeatedly naming Vance and the cabinet in their removal demands, by making the 25th Amendment invocation a central and explicit part of the public messaging, Democrats are doing something very specific. They are forcing every cabinet member to publicly answer the question of whether they believe the president's conduct justifies invoking that mechanism. Cabinet members who refuse to invoke the 25th Amendment in this context are now on the record saying they have reviewed a statement describing the potential annihilation of an entire civilization and concluded it does not meet the threshold for presidential unfitness. That is a position they will have to defend publicly. And in an environment where the 25th Amendment demand is coming from more than 70 members of Congress and is being covered by every major news outlet, the political cost of that refusal is real and visible in a way it might not be if the demand were coming from a smaller and less institutionally credible group of lawmakers. And here is the broader historical context that makes the emergency session demand both urgent and deeply consequential for understanding the long-term arc of the constitutional confrontation between this Congress and this White House. Because this is not the first time Congress has found itself in this specific position of demanding emergency removal and being forced to navigate the gap between the moral and legal urgency of the moment and the procedural and mathematical limitations of the constitutional tools available. And the pattern across multiple instances tells you something important about the structural tensions in American constitutional design that this moment is exposing. When Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer stood up after January 6th and said Trump must go immediately through the 25th Amendment or another impeachment, they were making the same basic structural argument that Markey and Murphy and Khanna are making now. The argument that a president has crossed a line so severe that the normal pace of constitutional accountability is too slow to be adequate. The argument that waiting for investigations, hearings, committee processes, and floor votes to work their way through the legislative calendar creates an unacceptable window of continued danger. And the argument that Congress has an affirmative moral and constitutional obligation to act faster than its normal procedures allow when the situation demands it. What happened in 2021 was that impeachment proceeded through the House, 10 Republicans voted yes, and 57 senators voted to convict, which was more than any previous impeachment trial, but still short of the 2/3 threshold. The 25th Amendment was not invoked because Pence declined to lead that process, and Trump served out the remaining days of his term. Now it is the present moment, and the same essential dynamic is presenting itself again. A president making statements that a significant number of lawmakers believe cross constitutional lines. A demand for emergency action. Two constitutional pathways on the table simultaneously. And the question of whether the people who have the actual constitutional authority to act, the cabinet, the vice president, are going to exercise it. The answer to that question in the previous instance was no. The answer to that question now is not yet known. And the emergency session demand is specifically designed to make that answer as visible and as politically costly to deliver as possible. So let us break it down into the key components that define this constitutional moment and its implications for the future of American governance. The first component to understand is that the emergency session demand is a real constitutional moment, not just political theater. and the specific legal frameworks being invoked by senior Democratic lawmakers give it a seriousness and a staying power that distinguishes it from previous rounds of removal rhetoric. Here is what you need to understand about why this round of removal demands is different in kind substantively, constitutionally, and in terms of the specific legal grounding being offered from the routine, partisan removal talk that fills the political media environment after every major Trump controversy, and that most observers have learned to treat as political noise rather than serious constitutional action. When Ed Markey calls for the House and Senate to reconvene on an emergency basis, he is not issuing a press release for social media engagement. He is making a specific procedural demand with a specific constitutional mechanism attached to it. A demand that requires the leadership of both chambers to respond publicly and on the record. The question of whether they believe the situation warrants emergency action. When Ro Khanna invokes the Geneva Conventions and says Congress must use every option, he is not reaching for political rhetoric. He is making a specific legal argument that a specific presidential statement violated specific treaty obligations that carry specific constitutional implications under the high crimes and misdemeanor standard. These are lawyers making legal arguments in the form specifically designed for legal accountability of the executive branch. And the combination of the Geneva Conventions framing, the war powers dimension, and the specific constitutional mechanisms being demanded puts this moment in a different legal register than previous rounds of removal talk that were driven more by political frustration than by specific legal analysis. Whether those arguments ultimately produce a constitutional outcome is a separate question from whether they are serious and legally grounded. They are both. And that seriousness is what makes the emergency session demand worth watching closely, even if the immediate political math makes removal unlikely. The second component to understand is that the 25th Amendment pressure campaign being run through these public demands creates real and lasting political consequences for Vance and the cabinet, regardless of whether they ever invoke it. And those consequences shape the internal dynamics of the Trump administration in ways that matter beyond the immediate removal question. Let us be clear and precise about the strategic logic here, because it is more sophisticated than it might appear on the surface when you first encounter it. And it is specifically designed to produce consequences that persist beyond the immediate news cycle, regardless of whether the formal 25th Amendment mechanism is ever actually invoked. When more than 70 members of Congress publicly demand that the Vice President and Cabinet invoke the 25th Amendment and name them by their constitutional roles. When senators with foreign policy credibility say publicly that the President's statement about wiping out a civilization warrants a declaration of unfitness, they are creating a political record. A permanent, documented, publicly attributed record of the specific question being put to those officials and the specific context in which it was asked. Every cabinet secretary who continues to serve under Trump after this public demand has effectively answered the question of whether they believe the civilization threat rises to the 25th Amendment threshold. Their answer, by their continued service and public silence on the invocation question, is no. And that no is now on the record. That record becomes relevant in a variety of future contexts. If the Iran situation escalates further, if another statement with similar legal implications emerges, if a future investigation examines what cabinet members knew and when they knew it, and what they did with that knowledge, the 25th Amendment demand creates a documented accountability trail for the people closest to the president that does not disappear when the immediate news cycle moves on. And that trail is part of what the emergency session demand is designed to produce, even if the formal removal mechanism it is calling for does not ultimately activate. The third component to understand is what this moment means for the constitutional future of presidential war powers, congressional authority, and the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches, and why what happens in the next few weeks on Capitol Hill matters far beyond just the question of Trump's removal. Here is the honest and complete picture of what is at stake in this constitutional confrontation. And I want to say this clearly because the full significance of what is happening goes beyond the question of whether Trump gets removed or whether Vance invokes the 25th Amendment. It goes to the fundamental question of whether Congress retains meaningful authority to constrain executive power when a president is willing to push every boundary simultaneously. The emergency session demand, whatever its immediate outcome, is one of the most important moments in the ongoing struggle over the shape of American constitutional governance in the modern era. And that matters for every president and every Congress that comes after this one. The struggle over presidential war powers has been going on for decades, quietly incrementally, and without the kind of dramatic public confrontation that finally forces the question into the open in an undeniable way. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution after Vietnam specifically because it recognized that the executive branch would always seek to expand its military authority beyond what the founders intended, and that without a formal legislative check, embedded in statute, presidents would eventually engage in major military actions, deploying forces, conducting strikes, escalating conflicts without any meaningful congressional input, authorization, or oversight. The law was passed with the specific intention of preserving congressional authority over the decision to go to war in an era of executive power expansion, and it has been stretched, tested, and worked around ever since. That resolution has been tested and stretched and worked around so many times since its passage that many legal scholars question whether it retains any real operational force as a constraint on presidential military action. What Trump's civilization threat does in the context of the emergency session demand and the war powers debate is crystallize the question that has been building for decades into a specific and undeniable public moment. Does Congress have any real authority to constrain a president who is publicly threatening to destroy a civilization on a unilateral deadline? Or has that authority so completely eroded through years of congressional deference that the only tools remaining are the extreme constitutional mechanisms of impeachment and the 25th Amendment? The emergency session demand reflects a constitutional breaking point. Everything else has been tried and failed. Watch for Republican leadership responses, administration legal reactions, and whether any GOP members engage with the war crimes framing, because even a handful could shift the math. The next chapter is being written now.